Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to discuss how to manage our cash flows like the rich. If you look at the various economic reports which comes every year and provide data on economic inequality in the world, one interesting fact we will find is that the top 1% richest population owns close to about 50% of the total world's wealth. In sharp contrast, the bottom 50% owns just 1% of the total world's wealth. And the most interesting thing about this data is that many social scientists and many economists believe that even if the total world's wealth today were to be redistributed equally to everyone in the world, within 5, 10 or maybe 15 years, we will be back to the same level of economic inequality, which means the top 1% will again own about 50% of the total world's wealth, whereas the bottom 50% will end up owning just 1% of the total world's wealth. This is interesting and probably there's a logic to it because wealth creation and generating wealth requires having the right financial intelligence, the right knowledge and the right skill set, which is why in today's video, we are going to discuss how the rich manage their cash flows to generate and grow their wealth as compared to how the poor or maybe even the middle class manage their cash flows. So let's begin. We're going to analyze these different cash flow patterns using the 5 basic and fundamental financial terms and 2 of the 3 financial statements which we have discussed in my earlier video. So in case you're not familiar with these terms or statements, please feel free to pause this video and watch that video first before continuing with this video. I will also put up a link in the description below. But to quickly recap, we talked about our personal profit and loss statement which captures our income as well as expenses. And we also talked about our personal balance sheet which captures our assets and liabilities. So we are going to use these 4 key terms and these 2 financial statements to understand and explain the different patterns of the 5th and probably the most important term, which is the cash flows. So let's look at our first cash flow pattern. In this cash flow pattern, the entire income which is earned either from salary, wages or fees is used up in expenses towards housing, clothing and fooding or other regular monthly or daily expenses. Since the entire income is actually used up in expenses, this cash flow pattern is said to be representative of the cash flow pattern of the poor because the condition of the poor is often described as living from hand to mouth. One interesting thing to notice in this particular cash flow is that this cash flow pattern impacts only our income and our expenses, which means it only impacts our personal profit and loss statement. This particular cash flow pattern doesn't impact our assets or our liabilities. In other words, this particular cash flow pattern doesn't impact our personal balance sheet. This particular cash flow pattern is also representative of the cash flow pattern of someone who is new into a job or a working career. Because as many of us can relate to, in the initial years of a job or a working career, our entire income usually is used up in expenses to meet our upgrade in lifestyle. And the usual worry typically is for the next increment or the pay raise to meet the increasing expenses towards lifestyle upgrade. But as the entire income is still used up in expenses for a higher lifestyle, this cash flow pattern also still represents the cash flow pattern of someone who is new into a job or a working career. And as you notice, this particular cash flow pattern is all about expenses because entire income is continually being used up in expenses. Therefore, there's often a saying for this particular cash flow pattern, which is the poor only have expenses. Let us now look at our second cash flow pattern. In this cash flow pattern, the entire income is no longer used up in regular monthly expenses. Due to increase in salary and income, we are now able to generate some extra savings or extra cash. And this extra cash and savings are now used to acquire liabilities. And what happens on account of this is that the liabilities will now add on or create extra expenses which will now be added on to our regular monthly expenses. This particular cash flow pattern is said to be representative of the cash flow pattern of the middle class who in an attempt to continuously upgrade their lifestyle end up buying liabilities with every pay increase or with every bonus that they receive. As you already noticed, this particular cash flow pattern start impacting our personal balance sheet. But one thing we need to note here again is that this particular cash flow patterns only impact our liabilities side of our balance sheet. It doesn't impact our assets. At this point, I think it's important to take a pause and try and understand the difference between assets and liabilities. Because assets and liabilities are defined in various ways for accounting purposes. But for personal finance management, I think the most practical definition is the one given by Robert Kiyosaki in his famous book Rich Dad and Poor Dad, which is assets put money into your pocket, whereas liabilities take money from your pocket. Let's try and understand this with an example. All of us think that owning a car is an asset, but it actually can be an asset or a liability depending on how we use it. If you're using a car or buying a car for personal use, then we have to regularly pay for the monthly EMI, assuming we have taken it on loan, and we have to pay for the maintenance, insurance, and you have to pay for the fuel. So on a regular basis, the car is taking money out of our pocket, so it becomes a liability. But if we were to use the same car for running it as an Ola or an Uber or a cab service, then hopefully at the end of the month, we would have earned more income or more money than the money we are expending on maintenance or fuel or even insurance. So the car, since it's actually putting extra money into our pocket, becomes an asset. This understanding of the difference between assets and liabilities is critical because this is probably what sets apart the rich from the poor or the middle class. One last thing I would like to mention here before we move on is, since this particular cash flow involves generating new liabilities, which actually puts extra burden on our expenses, we need to be careful that we don't load up too many liabilities. Otherwise, we are in the danger of falling into what is known as the middle class debt trap, which means you'll end up borrowing more and more money to actually service your own liabilities. Since this particular cash flow pattern, which is representative of the middle class, is all about acquiring liabilities using the extra cash or the extra savings, it's often said that the middle class only have liabilities. Let us now look at our third cash flow pattern. In this cash flow pattern, the extra savings or the extra cash which is being generated is now used to acquire assets rather than liabilities. So what this does is, the new assets which are being acquired will generate additional income which will be added on to our regular income in our profit and loss statement. This particular cash flow pattern is said to be representative of the cash flows of the rich because the rich have their money work for them. By using their surplus cash or savings to actually acquire assets rather than liabilities, they are able to generate more additional income rather than more expenses. This additional income increases the potential for more savings, which in turn creates the potential for acquiring more assets, thereby creating a virtuous cycle of more income generating more cash to buy more assets and more assets generating more income, and so on, which is why it's always said the rich always get richer. If you're able to achieve this virtuous circle of extra cash acquiring assets and these assets generating additional income on a regular basis, and if for example you're able to acquire enough assets which can generate an income equal to or greater than your monthly income, you have already achieved your financial independence, and maybe you can stop worrying about losing your job even. So we have now discussed the three cash flow pattern. Before we conclude, I would like to highlight two important points about these cash flow patterns. The first point is, these three cash flow patterns can also be viewed as the three different stages of achieving personal finance independence or freedom. We all typically start with the cash flow pattern of the poor when we are new into a job and slowly graduate to the cash flow pattern of the middle class. And what is critical is to effectively manage our cash flow pattern so that we finally upgrade to the cash flow pattern of the rich. Now the starting point for graduating from the cash flow pattern of the poor to the rich is effectively managing our personal finances. Hence, in the next video, we are going to discuss about the basics of personal finances and how to graduate from the cash flow pattern of the poor to the rich. And the second point is, these cash flow patterns not only explain why the rich are rich and the poor are poor, but it also explains why some people are able to preserve their wealth across generations and some people are not. So if you look at the cash flow pattern of the rich, the virtuous circle of the surplus cash being used to acquire assets, and those assets in turn generating additional income, leads to the rich becoming richer and also growing their wealth. But a reverse pattern whereby the assets are being sold or being dwindled away in the form of expenses or various luxuries, that will continuously bring down the income. And over time, that asset is completely destroyed or sold off, then the income comes back to zero. And all the assets which has been created will be lost, either in the same generation or in the future generations. And this explains why, many people who are rich in one generation becomes poor in the next generation. If you find this helpful, please like the video and leave your comment and feedback below as well. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do consider subscribing and hit the notification button so that you'll get an update the next time I upload a similar video on personal finance. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.